Righty ho folks, so this is our last of my cement video on crooks. So let's get going. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is, what do we know already about crooks? Now, the big chapter for crooks is chapter 4, but we hear of him in chapter 2 from the narrator, Candy, and we see him for the first time in chapter 3, and then we find out all about him in chapter 4. A lovely picture here of crooks. Right, let's get going. Righty ho, so in chapter 2 then, Candy tells us a little bit about crooks and the way the other ranch house men treat him. So the first thing I want to point out is, you see the stable bucks and nigger. Now let's look at the terminology used here. Remember, we want to think about AO2, how does Steinbeck present. So let's think about the N word. Well, of course, when you think about that, you're going to put that down in terms of the derogatory language, the fact that they would use such an abusive term. But remember, that's completely contextually relevant in relation to 1930s America. We would never use that term. We can see, the inappropriateness of it and how it is completely reductive. Yet at that time, it was a term that people would have used readily. However, context doesn't really enter into our assessment objectives here, so there's not really much that we want to say about that. But let's look at stable buck. Stable, place where horses are kept. Buck is the name of a male deer. So he is aligned with animal terminology, and that really represents his status on the ranch, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we think about the harness room. So the fact that he's called a stable buck, that they refer to him in that way, aligns him with animals rather than with humans, and we get an understanding that he is going to be seen as inferior, not only because of the use of the N word, but the fact that his job, he is the stable buck, that's his job, and his job is considered with the animals rather than with the rest of the ranch house men. And remember, that leads to the incredible loneliness that has embittered crooks, and we'll talk about that as well. But we'll leave his loneliness until we get to chapter 4. Right, so he's called crooks as well, and he's got a crooked back, and there you have the use of an aptonym, which means a name that is appropriate for your status or your personality. So the fact that he's called crooks and he's got a crooked back, Steinbeck uses that aptonym to put our focus really on the fact that he's labelled and defined by his disability and his race, isn't he? Just the same way that Curly's wife is labelled and defined by her position as being a possession of her husband, and the fact that she is treated in a way that is seen as subservient because of her gender. But Candy says this, yeah, nice fella too, and that's important, that Candy can recognise that Crooks is a nice fella. He can recognise his humanity beyond his race and beyond his disability. Remember, most people never look beyond those two things. And then he says, but the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot, got books in his room, and that separates him from the others who do not have those possessions or do not have that intellectual escape that Crooks has. So even though socially he is the lowest of the low, that he's aligned with animals, intellectually he is above the others. Remember, their reading material doesn't go beyond those Western magazines. And then we have the reference to the Christmas party when they let the nigger come in that night. Little Skinner named Smitty took after the nigger, done pretty good. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the nigger got him. Smitty says he could have killed the nigger. The guy said on account of the nigger's crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet. So here we have the violence of the rash, the fact that violence of the ranch, rather, not of the rash, but the violence of the ranch. And in a way that there are limits placed upon that violence. The ranch house men don't let Smitty use his feet because they recognise the disability, but they don't stop the fighting. So there are warped values, I suppose, that are apparent on the ranch. And you get a sense that perhaps the person who didn't let Smitty use his feet would have been someone like Slim. but of course that's just supposition, that's not stated. So what we have here is the idea that crooks is there to serve the animals, and the only service that he gives the men is the entertainment or the distraction they get out of beating him up. And it's a miserable existence for poor crooks. Okay, so this is chapter 3, and this is the first time we see crooks, and the really important thing here is the door opened quietly and the stable book put in his head, a lean negro head lined with pain, the eyes patient. Now just look at those two P words for crooks. They're really, really important, so please try and remember them. Lined with pain, his eyes patient. Lined with pain, the pain that he experiences on all levels, physically, emotionally, psychologically, the pain that crooks embodies. And remember, crooks is representative of I suppose the black experience at the time, that he is isolated, that he is treated as an inferior, that his value is never known or appreciated. And we have that lovely phrase, lined with pain, to encapsulate the enormity of sorrow and suffering that black people had experienced up until that point, but that crooks carries on a daily basis on his poor crooked back, the pain that rests upon his shoulders. And that's not just an internal thing, it's not just physical, but it's the emotional and psychological pain that he discusses more in chapter 4. The fact that he once lived the dream, that he once belonged, that he once had a family, and all of that has been lost. And the eyes are patient, and just look at the value that's placed upon that, that despite all that, his eyes are patient, because there's nothing else that he can be, patiently waiting for some hope, patiently waiting for something to change. And it gives you an idea that Steinbeck wants you to see crooks in a sympathetic way. And then look at how Slim treats him. Oh, hello, crooks, what's the matter? And then he says, oh, sure, crooks, I'll come and put it on. I can do it for you if you want, Mr. Slim. No, I'll come and do it myself. And he stood up. So Slim doesn't exploit crooks, doesn't take advantage of the fact that Crook says, oh, I'll do it for you. Slim does it himself. So the fact that Slim doesn't exploit crooks shows you again how he is the moral touchstone within the ranch life. It's his authority that we look to, because we know that it has a central moral core, and the way that he treats crooks here makes that apparent. Okay, so that idea of trying to understand crooks is made evident here in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is such a revealing chapter in relation to the experiences of crooks and how they have led to him becoming the man that he is. So Crooks had his bunk in the harness room. Now let's just look at that. In terms of AO2, let's think of symbolism here. What is Steinbeck doing by putting Crooks in the harness room? Well, one, it shows his isolation, that he's not in the bunkhouse with the rest of the men, that he is isolated, that he has another degree of separation. But the harness room is also a place where horse and other farm animals are fettered, restrained and controlled. And those are important words, because that's Crook's life. Crooks is constantly restrained, constantly controlled by the colour of his skin, by his disability and by the colour of his skin. So he's always going to be fettered, he's always going to be tied down. He doesn't have freedom. And the harnesses are constantly referred to in relation to crooks. We also get the sense that harnesses are referred to for the other characters. The harnesses jingled, and you get the sense that even though crooks is the restraining powers that are placed upon crooks, the fact that crooks is a man who is held back, that he's not the only man who's held back. All of the men in the ranch house are in some way restrained. They're harnessed to this particular way of life because of a lack of hope, because of there is no alternative. Socioeconomics mean that they have to do what they have to do to get by, and there's a sense that is disastrous for them. It's disastrous for crooks and it's disastrous for others. But crooks is twice controlled, firstly by his skin colour and second by his disability. So the harness room then, Steinbeck is using the harness room in a symbolic way to link crooks not only to animals in terms of his status, but to the idea that he is constantly controlled, that he is fettered, that he is tied down to this particular existence, that freedom has been denied him in that restraint. But he does have the freedom of his own mind in that room, and that's something that he holds on to with a tenacious grasp. Okay, aligning him once more with the animal imagery, we have here that his bunk, his bed, was a long box filled with straw. And again, it's this idea that the humanity of crooks is dismissed, that being aligned with animals, that the humanity is dismissed. And there's, the fact that that is a repeated motif, so, well, all motifs are repeated, or else they're not motifs. But the way that Steinbeck aligns him again and again to the language and the accessories most commonly associated with animals is a way of criticizing the society that dismisses the humanity of one because of the colour of their skin. So there's a sense of degradation here, that crooks is dismissed, that crooks is treated as an inferior because of his skin, and that can't be right. And again, we have the idea of the harness and the symbolic meaning behind that. On the wall hung a broken harness in the process of being mended. Who is it that mends the harnesses? Crooks. Now, a harness is a fetter. It's a way of controlling an animal. And here you have irony. So Steinbeck's using irony with this reference to the broken harness, because it's poor Crooks's job to fix the harnesses. So the things that hold other animals back, it's his job to fix. So he's a creature who's trapped. He's a man who's trapped. He's a man who's harnessed to a particular way of life, and yet it is his job to fix the harnesses for the other animals. When really all you want for Crooks is a way for him to break free from those fetters, to no longer be harnessed, but to be valued and to be loved and to have a dignity in the eyes of others. Right. Now, in terms of how life is different from Crooks in comparison to the other ranch house men, even though Crooks is separated by being in the harness room, there are perhaps some tiny advantages. And for Crooks, it might be this. Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stable-buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men. So you've got another bit of irony associated with Crooks here. Despite the fact that his status is demeaned, he has the advantage over the other man. He's a sense of security. He doesn't live under the perpetual threat of being canned. Remember, that's what Candy's worried about. That's why when he gossips about Curly, he says, oh, don't tell Curly. He doesn't want to be canned. Curly will never be canned because he's the boss's son. So Crooks doesn't have that anxiety. He doesn't have the restless, shiftless life that the other men fear, and that the other men unfortunately find too readily in experience. But what he does have is a sense that this harness room, for all that it is, it's his own, and he holds on to that. So the tiny little things that he has, so the fact that this is his place, the fact that he's got the freedom of his own thoughts, the fact that he's got rights within that room and he wants to exert them, all of those things are vital to him, because they give him some sense of ownership, some sense of value, some sense of worth that everything else in the world denies him. Now, again, we've got symbolism associated with Crook's possessions. So Crooks possessed books too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the Californian Civil Code from 1905. So the fact that racism has robbed him of his rights means that he then becomes obsessed with whatever rights that he can, that he can put his finger upon. And he has two books. One is the dictionary and the other is the mauled copy of the Civil Code. And it shows his fascination with what's denied him, his fascination with these rights, the rights that he is denied on a daily basis, and yet he has that mauled copy. The adjective mauled just shows you how often it is looked at, the fact that it's being used, and even though it's in a state of disrepair, he's looking at it all the time. But also that's a comment, really, isn't it? That's a comment on those rights, that this book is mauled, like those rights have been mauled. An idea that they have not been put into action, they are not the daily experience of people like crooks. So there's that idea that he has an obsession with his rights, and that obsession unfortunately is to a lost cause, because inside that inside that harness room, he has rights, but there's nobody there. There's nobody there to hear what they are, or they have no purpose, because there's nobody ever in that harness room but himself. And once he leaves the harness room, it doesn't matter what it says in the Californian Civil Code. He doesn't have any rights at all. He's the stable buck. Okay, so let's look at some AO2 here. Let's look at the compound adjective here in association with the spectacles. So his spectacles are gold rimmed, and they are they're referred to here in terms of that compound adjective gold rimmed, and by doing that, Steinbeck is placing a value upon these spectacles, and it lets you know that so does Crooks. Crooks places a value upon reading, because reading and education is his weapon. It's his one weapon. It's the one thing that he has over the other ranch house men, and he's got this one-man war against the discrimination that he faces each day, that constrains him, that holds him back, that keeps him in that harness. So reading is linked to freedom of thought in the novella, and you've seen that in chapter 3 with Bill Tenner's letter from the magazine. And remember, that letter was so important to Whit, because what it spoke of was the idea that you could escape ranch life, that you could get out of this cyclical existence where you get a stake, you blow your stake, and then you work again to get another one. And what we have here is, for Crooks, that reading speaks of his mental journey beyond the restrictions of that harness room. Yes, he may be restricted to ranch life, but in his mind he can go elsewhere. And the fact that and how does he do that? Through reading. And that's why the spectacles are so important, because they allow him to read about the rights that he's been denied. They allow him to escape from the daily torment and torture of what it's like to be the lowest of the low on the ranch. Okay, so let's think about his separation. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. Let's think of that word. He demanded that other people keep their distance. Well, who's coming near him? You know, it's all theoretical, because there's nobody who comes near him. And what we have here is that Crooks tries to protect himself from an obvious sense of rejection that he feels. Theoretically, he's controlling the access to the room, but it is only theoretically, because nobody comes to his room. He is isolated, and that he is alone, and nobody would come to his room voluntarily or in any sense of friendship. And therefore what he's trying to do is, he is exerting his rights in a theoretical way, because they don't actually mean anything. Nobody would come near him. He believes that if he doesn't let anybody in, then no one can hurt him by leaving. And remember, later in this chapter we find out about how much Crooks has lost. We don't know how or why, but we understand that the separation from those that he loved and who loved him is something that he has to live with each day, and that has made him the bitter person that he is. He has this brusque or rude manner, and why does he have it? Well, it's a defence mechanism, isn't it? Because he's so lonely, but even though he is so lonely, he fears that other people will hurt and exploit him. He lives daily with that hurt. He's fearful of it again and again. So if he separates himself from others, then he thinks he's protecting himself. It's his defence mechanism. A carapace is a hard outer shell, like you would have in a tortoise or a turtle. It's a hard outer shell, and that's what we have here for Crooks. Steinbeck presents him with his own carapace, his manner in relation to others, in relation to Lenny. It's rude, it's aggressive, but that is just a shell that he has had to that he has had to develop in order to stop himself from being hurt. He's been hurt so much, he's lost so much, and therefore he has to protect himself in the only way that he can. And that's with his aggressive hostility towards people like Lenny, the very few people who actually treat him with any sense of humanity. Not that Lenny does that deliberately, because Lenny, it's just who Lenny is. Right, so let's look at how Steinbeck uses physical description again. Physical description, appearance, is used so often to tell us about the personality and try to allow us to understand who these people really are. So his body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth seemed to glitter with intensity. Remember those patient eyes and that face lined with pain. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips, which were lighter than his face. Now, that's the second time that pain is associated with his face. So his face lined with pain in chapter 3, and here pain-tightened lips. So pain is at the heart of who Crooks is. So Crooks is weighed down by life's burden. You know, the fact that his spine is crooked, and we know that his spine is crooked because he got kicked by a horse, but his spine is crooked because of the burden that life has placed upon him as well. The repetition of the word pain, which I've mentioned there before, and he's defined by his colour and his disability. You know, and we've talked about the aptonym, the use of the name Crooks. Those intense eyes, those intense patient eyes, which bore into Lenny, as we find out later in this chapter. And if you think about eyes as the window of a person's soul, his eyes are intense, looking for something, intense and patient, looking for something that will get him out of the situation that he finds himself in day and daily. So we talked about that carapace, didn't we? How he can be rude, how he can be brusque, how he can be aggressive. And here we have it with our adverbs. Remember, Steinbeck loves his adverbs. So Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come into my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any rights in here but me." And again, that focus that he has on rights. The only right that he can feasibly exert is to deny visitors access to the room. But it's, again, how useful is that right when nobody comes to his room? And it creates a double irony here. Firstly, he's desperate for company. He yearns for companionship. And secondly, because of his status, no one in the ranch house would ever dream of visiting him. So it's ironic that he talks about his rights all the time. He has no rights, but what little rights he has, he holds on to them fiercely, tenaciously, because he's got to have something. For a man who has so little, he must treasure the tiny, tiny little bit of hope that he has, and that's in the fact that he can exert rights. And again, thinking about that carapace that he has developed, it's made him bitter and it's made him petty, and you get it here. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room. Doesn't that sound like a petty child? But what he's trying to do is he's trying to personalise his attack on Lenny. This is how my life is affected, so I'm going to affect your life in that way too. It's vindictive and it's petty and it's bitter, but it's completely and utterly understandable when we realise how he's been treated and how others view him. He tries to put Lenny in a similar position. Yes, he does, and yes, that's belittling, and yes, that speaks of a smallness of heart. But when you think about those that face lined with pain, those pain-tightened lips, when you think about how he's been treated, you can understand it. And remember, that's what Steinbeck's about. He's about letting you understand people, because he thinks that if you understand someone, it's more likely to lead to love than to hate. They play cards in there, but I can't play cards because I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, you all stink to me. And the repetition of that, they say I stink. Well, I tell you, you all stink to me. It shows you the mirror that Crooks has become, i.e. what is given to him he reflects back. They say he stinks, well I say you stink, and that is petty, and it does sound childish there through the use of repetition, but what it does, it shows you that Crooks is a mirror, that if you give him something like friendship, like hope, he will give that back. But if you do nothing but give him pain and misery and make him something that is seen as being inferior, then all he'll do is reflect those things back. And it's so sad, but again, we understand that about crooks, and when we understand it, then we can excuse it, condone it, and perhaps, well, I don't know about you, but just feel so angry that a man can be put in such a position just because of the colour of his skin, that people would act that way. Crooks scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. "Come on in and sit a while," Crooks said. "Long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit down," and his tone was a little bit more friendly. So that idea of Crooks as a mirror. Lenny smiles, and what happens? Crooks, despite himself, he can't resist that, and he offers friendship back. Lenny's smile reflects friendship, and Crooks reflects that back so quickly. The sharply and the scowled, those things have gone, and his tone now is a little more friendly. So let's think about that verb, scowled. It shows the facade, this idea that the exterior, the carapace, the emotional carapace that Crooks has had to develop. It is a facade, it is an exterior, it's not who he is as a person really. And the reaction to Lenny is quite immediate. What's beneath that scowl is a tone that's more friendly. It's a person who wants desperately to connect with another. And you've got that innocent, kind, natural smile of Lenny, and what it has done is it has disarmed Crooks. And it has literally disarmed him, because his weapon is his aggression, his weapon is his distance. And Lenny's smile has traversed that. It's covered the distance, and it has allowed Crooks to take down his shield just a little bit and let his tone become a little bit more friendly. And we get to see the man that he is beneath. So Crooks tells us about his life, about his childhood, when he was part of a family, when he was loved and valued and he felt secure, and where he belonged, where he wasn't separated. He shared a room with his brothers and he belonged. And the memory of that childhood is something that stays with Crooks when he speaks of it. Again, Steinbeck in his use of adverbs, he speaks dreamily. It implies that through reminiscence, Crooks can mentally escape into a better place. So through reading and through reminiscence, Crooks can escape the world that harnesses him, so that holds him back. That mental escape that he has, that in his mind he can be free. In his mind he can be valued once more. But in reality that's not so, and that's the tragedy of Crooks, that he had the dream that Lenny and George hold so dear, that they think they can achieve, perhaps now with Candy. That was something that Crooks had and Crooks lost. He Paradise Lost, he had it, and he doesn't have it any longer. And that inner tragedy is something that defines Crooks. And again, we understand that face that's lined with pain is not just lined with pain because of his existence now, but also the fact that he had something so desperately longed for by so many, and yet that's gone now. It only exists in the memories. And in that memory, or when he thinks of it, it transports him. He speaks dreamily of it. It's something that can offer him momentarily that feeling back of being valued and being loved. And then he reverts back to the type of person that he is, not the type of person that he is, but the type of person that he's had to become. Sometimes he talks and you don't know what the hell he's talking about. Ain't that so? He leaned forward, boring Lenny with his deep eyes. Ain't that so? So look at the verb choice here. Steinbeck uses boring Lenny with his deep eyes. It's important because it creates this climate of fear, or the fact that he's trying to intimidate and hold power over Lenny. He's never been in a position where he could hold power over a white man before, and here he's trying very clearly to do that with Lenny. he envies the connection that Lenny has with George, thinks that Lenny's unworthy of it. He's being vindictive. He's taken pleasure out of Lenny's pain, and that bitterness, that where he takes pleasure out of Lenny's pain, that bitterness is something that we understand. We understand why he's like that. So rather than immediately criticize him for it, we are left in a complex situation where we hate what he's doing, but we can understand where it comes from. He tells us a little bit more. I ain't no southern Negro, but he says, but I know now, and in reference to why his dad didn't like him playing with other white kids. He hesitated, and then he spoke again. His voice was softer. There wasn't another coloured family for miles around, and now there ain't a coloured man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad. He laughed. If I say something, why, it's just a nigger saying it. And what you have here is, let's look at that short sentence. His father knew about racism. His father lived the experience of racism, and when Crooks was young, when Crooks was a child, he was in some ways innocent of the terror of racism, of the torment that it can cause. But he knows that now because he's lived that experience. It's his daily experience. And what we have here is the impact of that knowledge, because racism has blighted his adult life, and it contrasts with the innocence that he had his childhood, where he didn't understand why his father didn't want him playing with white kids. And then this is the tragedy of Crooks, where he has taken on board that label, that N-word label. And why has he done that? Because if he takes it on board, if he calls himself that, then it won't hurt so much when somebody else does it. It's in some ways, it's a part of the defense mechanism. If I say I'm stupid, if I say I'm worthless, well then it won't hurt so much when they say I'm stupid and worthless. And that's a really terrible way to have to be, but it's something that Crooks has unfortunately had to develop. So he assimilates the socio-elect, he assimilates that N-word, not to fit in, but to temper the pain. Temper means to lessen it. Temper the pain by, I'll take that word, I'll call myself that, because then it won't hurt so much. Also psychologically, he's come to believe that. I believe that I am that. If we go back to the idea of Crooks as a mirror, people have done nothing but belittle him and reduce him to this terrible epithet, and now he accepts that. I accept that's who I am. And unfortunately, in doing so, all it does is perpetuate that terrible racist attitude. But Crooks's eyes are intense, and they're patient, waiting for something to change, waiting for some hope somewhere along the line, where it will not count what he says, where what he says will be of value because he says it, and he is a person who is valued. However, that's not going to happen within this novella. Just in relation to the assimilation of language there, this is just a nigger talking, and a busted back nigger, so it don't mean nothing. See, does that not break your heart? So that invective, that horrible language that is shown to him, or that is used in relation to him, it's a way of tempering the pain, as I said before, lessening the pain. That if he assimilates it, if I take on board what you say about me, and then it won't hurt so much. And that idea of Crooks as a mirror is so important there. Breaks your heart. Busted back nigger. You know, he understands that his status is belittled twice over because of his race and because of his disability. Okay, so we see the vindictiveness that exists within Crooks. Crooks's face lighted with pleasure. Paralleling Crooks with Candy there. Do you remember when Candy joins the attack, or he joined the attack with joy, took joy out of the fact that he could work with Carlson to demean Curly. Here Crooks' face Crook's face lighted with pleasure. So he enjoys the torture. And remember, he's torturing a white man here, so it's a double pleasure. So what he does is he uses suppositions. He supposes things. Suppose he gets killed or hurt and he can't come back. And it's his weapon of attack. He uses them to cause anguish. Why? Because anguish has been caused in relation to him day and daily, so he wants to hurt somebody else. He's just reflecting back what he's given. He hurts somebody weaker than himself because he's never really in a position to have somebody weaker than himself anywhere near him. Remember, Lenny is weaker because of his mental disability. And what he's doing is, it's lessening his own humanity. Yes, it is. It puts him on a par with Curly's wife, who comes in and does exactly the same thing in a matter of minutes. But it links this moment where his face lights with pleasure because he's torturing somebody else. It links him and Candy and Curly's wife. The three of them are linked from the fact that, or linked by the fact that they cause pain to others. But why do they do that? Why do they cause pain to others? Because they have been blighted. They've been blighted emotionally and psychologically by others. They are lonely, desperately lonely, and that loneliness makes them bitter. Okay, and here we have Crook's eyes bored into him. Now, we've had this verb choice twice now, and both times it gives us the idea of the intensity of Crook's emotional attack, that he really wants to hurt Lenny. And what we have here is, it suggests not just the intensity of his attack, but he makes sure that his torture is deeply felt and he hits the mark. And he wants Lenny to feel it deeply because he feels pain deeply every day. So why should somebody else not feel it now? Because if Lenny's feeling pain for a second, that means that Crooks isn't. That it's putting a momentary stop on the pain that he feels. So he lessens Lenny's stature through the simile. Want me to tell you what will happen? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. Again, Lenny being linked to animals, but here not in a way to suggest power or his innocence, but to suggest him being controlled or enslaved. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. And this is important because in chapter 5, when Slim is talking about Lenny or what George will have to do to stop Lenny being treated or being thrown into a cage. So this idea of Lenny being like a trapped animal is something that Crooks mentions here and that Slim mentions in chapter 5. And ultimately Lenny is trapped. He is like a trapped animal with the sound of the men coming closer and closer. And George has to do the decent thing. George has to sacrifice, has to make a sacrifice in order to give Lenny, in order to free Lenny. But anyway, we came off the point here with Crooks and his eyes boring into Lenny. So he lessens Lenny's stature through the simile, but he's also lessening his own humanity when he does it. That he takes pleasure from the pain that he derives. But again, we have to understand why Crooks is doing that, and when we do, it perhaps allows us to see him in a more sympathetic light. Okay, so what we have is the loneliness of Crooks. So when Lenny speaks of his hope, when he speaks of alfalfa and the rabbits, Crooks's tone becomes, Steinbeck says, scornful. He has watched a procession of men with the same damn thing in their heads, hundreds of them, and those men, hundreds of men who arrive at the ranch with the hope of a better life, who dream of independence, who dream of living off the fat of the land. But Crooks has seen them come and Crooks has seen them go, and he knows that that hope of a piece of land is something that drives the men forward, but that they never achieve it because they've nothing but bindles on their back. That idea that hope is something that Crooks has to live without. He's seen men desperately trying to fulfill a dream and always failing, and so hope is something that Crooks has become scornful of, not because he doesn't want to believe it, but because experience has proved how much hurt can be caused by the fact that people live in hope and they are always denied it. So he becomes scathing of hopes, and he says here, nobody never gets to heaven and nobody gets no land. So what is Steinbeck doing with that phrase? Nobody never gets to heaven and nobody gets no land. So the use of the double negatives there and the use of the repetition, where he is paralleling heaven, which is what everybody wants, and the idea of land. And what he is doing is he's making it seem as if it's his viewpoint is unquestionable, that there is no room for hope in this world. So his viewpoint is nihilistic, i.e., it rejects everything. It rejects all hope of anything being better. That life is meaningless. That there is no hope to be found in it. That there is nothing positive to be found in it. It's a crazy way to live your life, but unfortunately, he had experiences has taught him that this is the one way that he can live his life and offer himself some sense of protection. So nobody gets to heaven and nobody gets no land. The double negatives, the repetition. What we have here is that Crooks has developed this philosophy through experience, and therefore hope is something that he is scornful of. Okay, so let's think about that hope here. So, no matter how emphatically he expresses it, nobody never gets to heaven, nobody gets no land. It's not really what he feels, but as I said before, it's something that he's had to develop because of personal experience. It's part of this emotional and mental carapace, this protective, terrible protective dignity that he's had to develop in order to exist in a world, because that world demeans him, as I say here. It's hard to hope for a better life when your window upon the world has a manure pile underneath it. And the fact that Steinbeck places the harness room and the manure pile so closely together, it shows metaphorically how little value is placed upon Crooks. He's out there with the manure pile. He is just part of life's detritus, not needed, not valued. Just the fact that he is part of the world of animals and their excreta just lets you know that he is not valued as a human. There is no dignity in that life, and therefore if he has become embittered, therefore if he bores into Lenny with his intense eyes, therefore if he is scornful, we can understand why. But Crooks is clever. In some ways, you can parallel Crooks with Slim in that he understands. He understands how people operate, and he understands life, and he understands the tragedy of existence. He understands the tragedy of existence from a day and daily point of view. It's his tragedy. The tragedy of life and loneliness is something that he has lived. It's something that Slim understands. But Slim doesn't live it in the same way that Crooks does, because Slim isn't, Slim is the moral force of the ranch. He is the moral heart of it. Crooks is always at the periphery. Crooks is always at the edge. But anyway, he says, guys near crazy with loneliness for the land. But even though he knows that, he knows that guys go crazy with loneliness for lands, he wants to be part of it when hope emerges with Lenny and Candy. And Steinbeck does this through a short sentence. He hesitated. So when Crooks and when Candy and Lenny are speaking of the dream, Crooks hesitates, and it makes it clear that he's trying to align himself, that he's not only thinking about being as audacious as to cross that racial boundary, but the emotional one too. Is he going to let hope back into his life after everything that he has done to protect himself from further hurt? Is he going to be brave enough to allow hope back into his life? And Steinbeck does it with a double ellipsis. So he says, if you guys would want a hand, or would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come along. So the fact that he hesitates, the fact that the use of ellipses is there, just lets you know how much of a brave step it is for Crooks to try and let hope back into his life. He's nervous in that attempt to connect with others. He hesitates before speaking from the heart. And the fact that he says, if you want a guy to work for nothing, he doesn't place any value upon himself. He he doesn't have any sense of value in what he can do. I'll work for nothing. It also shows you how desperate he is. Desperate he is to try and find a way out of this life that he leads, a life that has caused him so much pain. The dialogue here is very slow paced to let you know that Crooks is tentative, that he's uncertain, because what he's doing is taking such a huge emotional step to let hope back into his life. He dares to hope, but in doing so he accepts that in the eyes of others he is no value. He's happy to work for nothing, just his keep. But the crucial point here is that Candy's faith and the potential for hope enters into the harness room, and that's enough to draw Crooks out of the protective, terrible protective dignity that he's had to adopt to survive. He lets down his shield and he allows the light of hope that Candy and Lenny exude. He allows that into his world, and that's a brave step for him to take. And then Crooks feels a sense of connection that gives him power. So when Candy tries to stand up to Curly's wife when she appears in chapter 4, he dares to dream, and he dares to stand up to someone who has done nothing but belittle him. He attempts to stand up to Curly's wife. "I've had enough," he said coldly. And the idea that he's going to stand up, I've had enough, that he feels that he can do something about this. Where does that power come from? Well, that power comes from the unity he feels with Candy and Lenny, the power of human connection, the fact that he's connected with Candy and Lenny, and that revitalizes Crooks, he says coldly. However, all that Curly's wife has to do is she has to mention that one reductive term, the N-word, and link it to the threat of lynching, and then the hope goes. And Steinbeck does it literally. He uses the word hopelessly. So that tiny little glimmer, that little flame that came with that human connection, it is snubbed out as soon as Curly's wife uses the N-word, because it is there in the adverb choice that Crooks stares hopelessly, and the power of that adverb lets you know that hope is gone, that optimism is being defeated, and that human connection that brought it into the room has been dismissed by the racial prejudice of Curly's wife and of the times. She is just a mouthpiece of the time that she lived in, and that reductive term lets him remember that he is that busted back N-word, and what does that matter to anyone? Nothing. Not to anybody else, and not even to himself. So the reality of racism trumps the power of hope, and in an act of self-protection, Crooks obliterates his presence as a man and as a human. And Steinbeck uses this phrase that he reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. And let's just think about what's implied there. He reduces himself to nothing, that he has to deny his humanity in order to live, and because others do that for him. You know, there's a certain irony in the phrase reduced himself to nothing, because other people have done that for him. Other people have reduced him to such an extent that he doesn't even see himself as human anymore. That's not something that he has controlled. That is something that others have done to him, and now he has no choice but just to follow the path that they've set for him. And so he has no personality, he has no ego, because it's the only way to protect himself. That terrible protective dignity that unfortunately he has to live with. So without hope, Crooks has nothing but his fragile rights, and we're back to the start again. We're back to chapter 4, where he exerts his rights even though they don't really mean anything, and here at the end of the chapter all he can do is exert rights that he says he doesn't even like them, but he has to have some of them. So he has a right to be lonely even though he hates being lonely. So we've got this cycle, this cyclical world of pain that Crooks is trapped by. And that idea of him being trapped is reinforced with the motif of the halter chains rattling. When Curly's wife leaves, the halter chains rattle. And Steinbeck uses that throughout the novella to give you this idea that these men are controlled, that they're controlled by their pain, they're controlled by their loneliness, they're controlled by a society that sees them just as weak ones, that doesn't put value upon them. Curly's wife has crushed the Hope, she's belittled them, she has emasculated, dehumanised Crooks, and Crooks is left alone with his pain, and that's visually reinforced by the last image we have of him as he fell slowly to rubbing his back, rubbing the source of his pain. But this isn't just his physical pain, but it's his mental and emotional pain, his isolation, which causes that mental and emotional pain, the fact that he's dehumanised every day, a source of his pain. And we remember the pain-lined face and the pain-tightened lips. Pain really sums up Crooks's existence. Crooks is so controlled that he can't even afford to dream, and Steinbeck presents him here as a symbol of Black America, the Black American experience that we mentioned before. Just like other members of his race, it hurts Crooks too much to hope for a life free of oppression. And that's why he hesitated. That's why Steinbeck uses the short sentence, he hesitated, when Candy speaks of the dream and the fact that it could actually happen. Because it's so hard to hope and so hard to allow yourself that idea that you can be hurt when it's denied, and it'll always be denied. He knew that. He said in chapter 4, nobody never gets to heaven, nobody gets no land. And yet, even though he knew that, even though he expressed it in such nihilistic terms, he allowed himself for that tiny moment the opportunity to dream. So it hurts Crook too much to hope for a life free of oppression. He urges Candy to dismiss his suggestion, he says, of playing that part of hoeing and doing jobs. Remember that he wanted to do not for any value, not for anything other than his keep. I didn't mean it, just fooling. Oh, God bless. So I didn't mean it. I was just fooling. He denies the idea that he was actually sincere, because it just hurts so much to be denied hope. Hurts so much to be denied a chance of escape. Curly's wife warned him to keep his place, and in order to survive, that's what he has to do. He has to keep his place. And he says only for a moment can he forget what she says is true. Oh, God bless. And remember when he was so vociferously saying, sure, it doesn't matter, it's just a busted black nigger who says it. But it did matter to him. It always matters to him. But he has to forget. He has to forget that for a moment in their company, he could allow himself to forget that what she says is true. But he has to accept what she says is true, that he is just the N-word. That's the only way to survive, is to accept it. And that is a terrible situation for anyone to be in. And Steinbeck is criticising the society where that allows such inhumanity not only to happen, but to be accepted as the norm.